330 AD, the banks of the Bosphorus. For centuries, the name Rome evoked images of marble forums, sprawling aqueducts, and the absolute authority of the Senate. But by the 4th century, the heartbeat of the empire was fading. Rome, the eternal city, was no longer the center of the world. It was a city of ghosts, burdened by its own history, increasingly vulnerable to the shifting tides of migration, internal corruption, and the sheer logistical impossibility of governing a continent from the Italian peninsula. The empire was too vast, too fractured, and too chaotic to be steered from the Tiber. Enter Constantine the Great. Constantine was a man of profound ambition and perhaps divine intuition. He had emerged from the bloody civil wars of the early 4th century not just as a victor, but as a ruler who understood that for the Roman Empire to survive, it had to undergo a fundamental metamorphosis. He realized that the future of the empire did not lie in the West, amidst the decaying grandeur of Italy, but in the East, where the wealth was concentrated, where the trade routes pulsed with life, and where the most sophisticated civilizations awaited. But where specifically would he plant the flag of a new era? Constantine's gaze fell upon an ancient Greek settlement, Byzantium. Situated on a strategic peninsula, Byzantium was a masterstroke of geography. It sat at the precise crossroads of Europe and Asia, commanding the narrow strait that linked the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. To control Byzantium was to control the world's most vital artery of commerce and military movement. The decision was not merely political, it was visionary. Some historians suggest Constantine saw a sign, a celestial omen or a divine nudge that pointed him toward this site. Regardless of the spark, the intent was clear. He was not merely moving a capital, he was founding a new reality. He intended to build a new Rome. The scale of the undertaking was staggering. This was not a gradual migration of bureaucrats. It was a total reconstruction of imperial identity. As the legions and the administrators began their trek eastward, they carried with them the weight of Roman law, the structure of Roman governance, and increasingly the burgeoning spirit of Christianity. Constantine began to transform the modest walls of Byzantium into the monumental foundations of a global superpower. He laid out streets that mirrored the grandeur of the Forum Romanum. He commissioned massive forums, hippodromes, and palaces that would dwarf anything the West had seen in generations. He was crafting a stage upon which the drama of the next 1,000 years would unfold. By naming this city Constantinople, he was signaling a seismic shift in the cosmic order. The center of gravity was moving. The old world of the Caesars was being eclipsed by a new, more resilient, and more spiritual entity. This was the moment the transition began, the moment the Roman Empire ceased to be a Mediterranean power focused on the West and began its long, glorious, and turbulent journey as the Byzantine Empire of the East. The foundations were laid, the vision was set, and the stage was prepared for the rise of the city of cities. 330 AD, the shores of the Bosphorus. The vision Constantine had planted in the soil of Byzantium was no longer a mere blueprint. It was a feverish, living reality. What began as a strategic relocation was rapidly evolving into a construction project of mythic proportions. This was not simply the building of a city, it was the engineering of an eternal bastion. To ensure that this new Rome would never suffer the indignities of siege or the chaos of barbarian incursions, Constantine and his successors understood that beauty alone was not enough. A city could be magnificent, but if it could not hold, it was merely a gilded tomb. The construction was a monumental feat of logistics and sheer human will. Thousands of architects, stonemasons, engineers, and laborers were summoned from every corner of the empire. They brought with them the most advanced Roman techniques of hydraulic engineering, monumental masonry, and urban planning. They didn't just build houses, they sculpted a landscape of power. The heart of the city was designed to pulse with the rhythm of imperial life. The Hippodrome, a massive U-shaped arena, was constructed to host the chariot races that would become the social and political heartbeat of the populace. Massive forums were erected, serving as both marketplaces and theaters of statecraft, where the emperor's presence was felt even when he was absent. Vast cisterns were carved deep into the earth, creating massive underground reservoirs to ensure that even during a prolonged blockade, the lifeblood of the city, water, would never run dry. But the true genius of Constantinople lay in its defensive geometry. The city was situated on a triangular peninsula, flanked on three sides by the sea, the Golden Horn to the north, the Bosphorus to the east, and the Sea of Marmara to the south. This natural aquatic moat provided a formidable first line of defense, making a full encirclement by land-based armies almost impossible. However, the landward side, the narrow neck of the peninsula that connected the city to Europe, remained the empire's greatest vulnerability. To close this gap, the Romans turned to the most sophisticated fortification techniques of the ancient world. They didn't just build a wall, they built a multi-layered system of death. Massive stone ramparts were raised, reinforced by towers, and designed to be deep enough to absorb the shock of any siege engine. These early fortifications were the precursors to the legendary defenses that would define the city's identity for a millennium. As the marble columns were raised and the heavy gates were swung into place, the transformation was complete. Constantinople was no longer a Greek outpost. It was a sprawling, multi-ethnic metropolis, a glittering jewel of the East that stood as a defiant statement to the world. It was a city of unparalleled wealth, a repository of ancient knowledge, and a fortress that seemed, to those who looked upon its rising walls, truly invincible. The stage was now set. The infrastructure of empire was in place, the wealth of the Silk Road was flowing through its gates, and the walls were beginning to rise. The city of cities had arrived, and it was ready to endure the storms of history that were already gathering on the horizon. 330 AD, the streets of Constantinople. As the physical foundations of the city solidified, a much more profound transformation was occurring beneath the surface of Roman life. The empire was not just being rebuilt in stone and mortar, it was being reborn in spirit. For centuries, the Roman identity had been inextricably linked to the old gods, Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, the pantheon that had guided legions from the Tiber to the edges of the known world. But the winds of change were blowing, and they carried the scent of incense from a rising, once forbidden faith. The transition from a pagan empire to a Christian one was not an overnight revolution, but a seismic shift that redefined the very soul of the state. For generations, Christians had been the outcasts of the Roman world, living in the shadows of persecution, facing the lions of the arena and the whims of emperors who viewed their refusal to honor the state gods as a form of treason. But the tide had turned. With the Edict of Milan, the era of the martyr was yielding to the era of the believer. Constantine, the architect of this new capital, understood something his predecessors had failed to grasp: A unified empire required a unified faith. He saw in Christianity not just a spiritual movement, but a powerful social glue capable of binding a fracturing Mediterranean world. By embracing the cross, Constantine wasn't just adopting a religion. He was aligning the imperial throne with a divine mandate. The emperor was no longer merely the first citizen of Rome. He was becoming the protector of the church, the earthly shadow of a heavenly king. As the decades progressed, the influence of the church seeped into the very fabric of imperial administration. The once silent basilicas began to rival the grand temples of antiquity in splendor. The hierarchy of the church began to mirror the hierarchy of the state, creating a seamless web of authority that stretched from the furthest provinces to the great palace. To be Roman was increasingly to be Christian. To serve the emperor was to serve the will of God. This spiritual consolidation reached its zenith under his successors, most notably Theodosius I. It was under his reign that the transformation became absolute. With the Edict of Thessalonica, Christianity was no longer just tolerated. It was declared the official state religion of the Roman Empire. The old temples were shuttered, the pagan rituals were outlawed, and the incense that once rose to the old gods now drifted toward the altars of Christ. This was a moment of no return. The empire had traded its classical pluralism for a singular, dogmatic devotion. This new religious identity would provide the Byzantine people with an unshakable sense of purpose and a common language of belief that would sustain them through the coming centuries of war and upheaval. But this unification came with its own set of complexities. As the empire became a Christian monolith, the definition of orthodoxy became a matter of life and death. Theological disputes were no longer mere academic debates. They were political crises that could spark riots in the streets of Constantinople or ignite civil wars in the provinces. The empire had found its soul, but in doing so, it had also found its greatest internal source of friction. The divine peace they sought would now be fought for in the halls of power and the shadows of the cathedrals. 395 AD, the imperial frontiers of the Roman world. While the East was consolidating its spiritual identity, the political unity that had held the Roman world together was fracturing. Upon the death of Theodosius the Great, the empire was formally divided between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. It was a division intended to make the massive realm more manageable, but in reality, it created a fatal disconnect. The two halves of the empire, though sharing a religion and a name, were now drifting into two different destinies. As the 5th century dawned, the Roman world faced a storm that no amount of theological debate could weather. The Pax Romana, that long era of relative stability, was being torn asunder by a phenomenon the Romans had struggled with for centuries: the Great Migrations. Driven by the terrifying expansion of the Huns in the Eurasian steppes, vast waves of Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Vandals, the Suebi, and the Alans, were being pushed toward the Roman borders. These were not merely raiding parties. They were entire nations on the move, fleeing for survival and seeking the fertile lands of the Roman provinces. In the West, the catastrophe was absolute. The Rhine frontier, once a formidable barrier, collapsed under the weight of the crossing. The once invincible legions found themselves unable to stem the tide. In 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. Alaric and his Visigoths breached the walls of Rome itself. For the first time in 8 centuries, the Eternal City had fallen to a foreign foe. The psychological blow was devastating. To the people of the ancient world, the sack of Rome was not just a military defeat. It was an omen of the end of civilization itself. As the decades progressed, the Western Empire became a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms. The Vandals swept through Gaul and Hispania before crossing into North Africa, seizing the empire's breadbasket and cutting off the vital grain supply. The central authority in Ravenna became a ghost, a puppet of the very barbarian generals who were supposed to protect it. By 476 AD, the final shadow fell. When the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the young Emperor Romulus Augustulus, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist as a political entity. The eagle had fallen in the West. But as the lights of Rome and Carthage flickered and went out, a different story was unfolding in the East. While the West collapsed into a fractured landscape of successor kingdoms, the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, remained standing. The loss of the West was a profound trauma, a wound that would never truly heal, yet it also served as a brutal catalyst for survival. The East was forced to look inward, to fortify its borders, and to realize that it was no longer part of a Mediterranean whole, but a singular, besieged bastion of Roman and Christian identity. The resources, the wealth, and the administrative genius of the empire were now concentrated in a single, impregnable heart, Constantinople. The West had fallen to the chaos of the migrations, but the East had found a new, leaner, and more resilient purpose. The Roman world was shrinking, but the Byzantine world was just beginning to find its strength in the crucible of survival. 450 AD, Constantinople. While the Western Roman Empire dissolved into a mosaic of barbarian kingdoms, the East understood a fundamental truth that its Western counterparts had forgotten. Survival in an age of chaos required more than just legions. It required an unbreakable foundation. As the migrations continued to surge toward the Bosporus, the emperors of the East realized that Constantinople, for all its strategic beauty, was dangerously vulnerable. The city was a prize too tempting for any conqueror to pass up, and its existing defenses were insufficient for the scale of the storm gathering on the horizon. To ensure that the fall of Rome would not be the fall of the East, a monumental undertaking began. This was not merely a construction project. It was an act of existential defiance. Under the direction of Emperor Theodosius II, the empire embarked on one of the greatest engineering feats of the late antique world, the creation of the Theodosian walls. These were not simple stone ramparts. To understand the brilliance of the Theodosian walls, one must visualize a layered system of defense so sophisticated that it would remain virtually unbreachable for over 1,000 years. The defense began not with a wall, but with a wide, deep moat, a massive trench designed to break the momentum of any siege engine or infantry charge. Beyond the moat sat the outer wall, a lower barrier intended to absorb the initial shock of an assault and provide a platform for archers. But the true heart of the system was the inner wall. This was a colossal structure, rising nearly 50 feet into the air, constructed of alternating layers of stone and brick. This wasn't just for aesthetics. The brick layers acted as shock absorbers, allowing the walls to flex slightly during earthquakes or under the impact of heavy battering rams without shattering. Rising from this inner wall were a series of massive, crenellated towers, spaced strategically to provide interlocking fields of fire. Any enemy who managed to cross the moat and scale the outer wall would find themselves trapped in a killing zone, caught in a deadly crossfire between the two layers of fortifications. The engineering was a masterclass in mathematics and logistics. Every tower was positioned to cover the gaps of its neighbor, ensuring there were no blind spots for an attacker to exploit. The walls didn't just wrap around the city, they hugged the topography of the landscape, turning the very earth into a weapon. As these massive limestone and brick structures rose above the Thracian plains, they did more than just provide physical security. They provided something far more precious to a fracturing empire: psychological certainty. The Theodosian walls transformed Constantinople from a mere capital into an impregnable fortress. They sent a clear message to the migrating tribes, the Persian kings, and the rising caliphates. The Roman flame might be flickering, but here, in this singular, fortified heart, it would burn unextinguished. The West had relied on sprawling frontiers and mobile armies that could no longer be sustained. The East, however, had built a shield. As the 5th century progressed, the Theodosian walls became the definitive line between the chaos of the collapsing Old World and the enduring resilience of the new Byzantine era. The stage was set. The fortress was ready. Now, the empire would have to prove it could live within the shadow of its own greatness. 476 AD, Ravenna. As the shadow of the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, vanished into the annals of history, the world underwent a violent tectonic shift. The Roman West did not simply change, it shattered. The centralized authority that had once unified Europe from the Atlantic to the Danube dissolved into a fractured mosaic of Germanic kingdoms: Visigoths, Vandals, and Ostrogoths carving out territories from the ruins of old provinces. The Great Silk Road was severed, the complex tax systems of the West collapsed, and the sophisticated urban life that had defined the Mediterranean world began to retreat into the darkness of localized, agrarian feudalism. This was the descent into the early Middle Ages, an era of profound contraction, where literacy, law, and long-distance trade became luxuries of a bygone era. But while the West was drowning in this sea of fragmentation, a different story was being written in the East. While the Western Roman Empire succumbed to the weight of its own instability, the Eastern Roman Empire, the nascent Byzantine state, did something miraculous. It stabilized. It did not merely survive the transition, it thrived by fundamentally redefining what it meant to be Roman. Where the West had relied on a fragile web of overextended borders and a military that could no longer pay its soldiers, the East leaned into its greatest asset: the impenetrable core of Constantinople. The survival of the East was not an accident of geography, though the Bosporus provided a vital lifeline to both Europe and Asia. It was a triumph of institutional continuity. While the Western provinces saw their administrative structures burn, the Eastern bureaucracy remained intact. The emperor in Constantinople was not just a military leader. He was the vicar of God on earth, a sacred figurehead who provided a sense of cosmic order that the barbarian kings of the West could never replicate. This fusion of Roman political tradition, Greek culture, and Christian theology created a new, resilient identity, a Byzantine identity, that was far more cohesive than the crumbling Roman identity of old. Furthermore, the East possessed something the West had lost: liquidity. The wealth of the Silk Road flowed through the hands of Byzantine merchants, ensuring that the imperial treasury remained full. This gold allowed the emperors to do what no Western chieftain could: to maintain a professional, standing army and to engage in the sophisticated diplomacy of gold, essentially buying off enemies or bribing them to fight one another. As the 5th century gave way to the 6th, a stark divide emerged on the map of the world. To the west lay a landscape of shifting tribal borders, isolated monasteries, and the slow decay of classical knowledge. To the east lay a centralized, urbanized, and highly organized superpower. The East had successfully pivoted. It had transformed from a sprawling, vulnerable Mediterranean empire into a compact, fortified, and deeply religious state. The fall of Rome was not a singular event that claimed the entire Roman legacy. It was a bifurcation. The West fell to the chaos of the migrations, but the East stood firm, shielded by its walls, fueled by its wealth, and unified by its faith. The Middle Ages had begun, but for the Byzantines it was not an age of darkness. It was an age of survival, and the foundation was set for a new era of imperial grandeur. 527 AD, Constantinople. The era of mere survival was over. The age of restoration had begun. If the 5th century was defined by the contraction of the Roman world, the 6th century would be defined by a single, relentless impulse, the refusal to accept the loss of the past. At the center of this imperial resurrection stood a man who was not born to the purple, but who would eventually redefine it. Justinian I, known to history as Justinian the Great, ascended the throne not as a descendant of ancient emperors, but as a man of humble origins, a peasant from the Balkans who had climbed the ladder of bureaucracy through sheer intellect and political maneuvering. Justinian was a man possessed by a singular, almost divine obsession. He did not view the current state of the Mediterranean as the new reality. He viewed it as a temporary aberration. To him, the Germanic kingdoms occupying Italy, North Africa, and Spain were not legitimate sovereigns, but squatters on Roman soil. His vision was nothing less than renovatio imperii, the restoration of the empire. He dreamed of a world once again unified under a single law, a single faith, and a single Roman eagle. But Justinian understood a truth that many conquerors overlook. An empire cannot be held by the sword alone. A state is not merely a collection of territories. It is a collection of rules. As he looked upon the chaos of the empire, he saw a legal system that had become a labyrinth of contradictions, ancient edicts, and forgotten customs. If he was to reclaim the West, he first had to codify the East. He had to ensure that the very concept of Romanness was etched into a structure so rigid and so logical that it could outlast any barbarian invasion. This was the birth of the Corpus Juris Civilis. Justinian summoned the finest legal minds of his age, tasking them with a monumental feat: to sift through a millennium of Roman legal thought, to purge the inconsistencies, and to distill the essence of Roman justice into a cohesive, written body of law. This was not merely an administrative task. It was an act of intellectual conquest. By streamlining the law, Justinian was providing the empire with its skeletal structure, the invisible architecture that would allow the state to function even when the emperors were weak or the borders were under siege. His ambition was total. He sought to master the land through reconquest, the soul through religious orthodoxy, and the mind through the law. He was a ruler who operated on a scale that bordered on the megalomaniacal. To Justinian, the emperor was the living embodiment of the nomos, the law. To obey the emperor was to obey the divine order of the universe. Yet this grand vision was not to be achieved in isolation. Behind the curtain of imperial majesty, his ambitions were matched by a partner of equal iron will. As Justinian prepared to reach across the Mediterranean to reclaim the lost provinces, he was not merely a man leading an empire. He was a man attempting to rewrite the destiny of the human race. The stage was set for a reign of unprecedented splendor, but also one of immense cost, as the dream of a restored Rome began to collide with the harsh realities of a changing world. 527 AD, Constantinople. If Justinian was the architect of the Roman dream, then the woman standing beside him was the steel that reinforced its foundation. To understand the reign of Justinian, one must understand Theodora. But to understand Theodora, one must first look past the silk robes and the imperial diadem to the shadows of the hippodrome, where her story began. She was not born to the aristocracy. In the eyes of the Roman elite, she was a creature of the gutter, a daughter of a bear-keeper, an actress, a woman whose very presence in the imperial court was considered a scandal of the highest order. In the social hierarchy of the 6th century, she was nothing. In the eyes of the law, she was a pariah. Yet, it was this very descent from the fringes of society that provided her with a perspective no other ruler possessed. She understood the pulse of the streets, the desperation of the poor, and the volatile whims of the masses. When Justinian fell in love with her, he did something unprecedented. He defied the very laws he sought to codify. He pressured the Senate to change the ancient prohibitions against marrying women of low social standing, effectively rewriting the social fabric of the empire to accommodate his heart. When they ascended the throne together, the partnership that emerged was unlike any other in human history. Justinian provided the grand vision, the legal intellect, and the imperial drive. But Theodora provided the pragmatism, the grit, and the survival instinct. Where Justinian was prone to the abstractions of law and theology, Theodora was grounded in the brutal realities of power. Nowhere was this more evident than during the Nika riots of 532 AD. The city was in flames. The factions of the Hippodrome, the Blues and the Greens, had united in a fury that threatened to tear the very heart out of Constantinople. The streets ran red with blood, and the palace was under siege. Justinian, paralyzed by the chaos, looked to the exits. His advisors urged him to flee, to abandon the throne and save his life, to let the empire crumble so that he might survive in exile. It was in this moment of absolute collapse that the empress stepped forward. She did not speak of divine right or legal precedent. She spoke of dignity. She famously declared that royalty is a fine burial shroud, arguing that it was better to die an empress than to live a fugitive. Her courage acted as a lightning rod, snapping Justinian out of his indecision and galvanizing his resolve. The riots were crushed, the throne was secured, and the path for his great reconquests was cleared. But her influence extended far beyond moments of crisis. Theodora was a silent architect of social reform. She championed the rights of women, pushing for laws that protected them from exploitation, legalized divorce, and granted them greater rights to property and inheritance. She was a protector of religious minorities, often shielding those persecuted by the state's official orthodoxy, playing a complex game of religious diplomacy that kept the empire's fractured factions from total civil war. She was not merely a consort, she was a co-regent. Behind the splendor of the Hagia Sophia and the movement of the legions lay the iron will of a woman who had risen from nothing to command everything. Justinian may have dreamed of a restored Rome, but it was Theodora who ensured that the dream did not perish in its infancy. 533 AD, Carthage. With the internal fires of the Nika riots extinguished and the throne secured, Justinian turned his gaze away from the politics of the capital and toward the lost horizons of the West. For decades, the Roman world had been fractured, its western provinces swallowed by Germanic tribes and its Mediterranean prestige eclipsed by the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. To Justinian, this was not merely a geopolitical loss, it was a theological and historical affront. The dream of a restored, unified Roman Empire was no longer a vague ambition, it was an imperial mandate. But a mandate requires a hand to wield the sword. For this, Justinian turned to his most trusted instrument, Flavius Belisarius. Belisarius was not a man of political maneuvering or courtly intrigue. He was a soldier of pure, distilled genius. A product of the Eastern military tradition, he possessed an uncanny ability to read the battlefield, and perhaps more importantly, an ability to achieve the impossible with limited resources. As the imperial fleet set sail for Africa, Belisarius carried with him more than just legions. He carried the weight of a 1,000-year-old legacy. The Vandal kingdom, once a formidable maritime power, had grown complacent. They did not expect the lightning strike that Belisarius delivered. In a campaign defined by speed and tactical brilliance, the Byzantine forces tore through the Vandal defenses. At the Battle of Ad Decimum, Belisarius's disciplined maneuvering turned a chaotic skirmish into a rout. Within a matter of months, the Vandal kingdom had collapsed, and the African provinces, once the breadbasket of the West, were once again under the shadow of the double-headed eagle. Yet Africa was merely the prelude. The true prize, the heart of the Old World, lay across the sea, Italy. The campaign for Italy would be far more grueling, a protracted struggle that would test the limits of Byzantine endurance. The Ostrogoths, the masters of the Italian peninsula, stood in the way of the Roman dream. In 535 AD, Belisarius landed in Sicily, beginning a campaign that would see him reclaim Naples, Rome, and much of the peninsula. He fought not just against armies, but against sieges, starvation, and the sheer logistical nightmare of maintaining a distant front. In the streets of Rome, Belisarius became a legend. He reclaimed the Eternal City, walking through its ruins not as a conqueror of a foreign land, but as a son returning to a lost home. To the local populace, the arrival of the Byzantines felt like the return of civilization itself. But the shadow of the Gothic wars grew long. What was envisioned as a swift restoration turned into a decades-long war of attrition. The Ostrogoths, driven by a desperate desire to preserve their own sovereignty, refused to break. The Italian landscape, once the jewel of the Mediterranean, was slowly bled dry by constant siege and counter-siege. Belisarius achieved the miraculous, but he was often fighting with one hand tied behind his back. Justinian's paranoia and the empire's dwindling coffers meant that the general was frequently recalled or denied the reinforcements necessary to finish the task. The Reconquista was a triumph of spirit and strategy, yet it revealed a haunting truth. The empire had the will to reclaim its past, but perhaps not the strength to hold it forever. 537 AD, Constantinople. While Belisarius was bleeding the Italian peninsula dry to reclaim the physical borders of the Roman world, Justinian was obsessed with reclaiming its spiritual heart. The emperor understood a fundamental truth of power. Empires are not held together by legions alone, but by the awe they inspire. To truly cement his legacy as the restorer of Rome, Justinian needed more than just territory. He needed a monument that would make the heavens feel reachable. He needed a structure that would dwarf the achievements of antiquity and serve as the definitive heartbeat of Christendom. The task was nothing short of architectural heresy. The previous great church, the predecessor to the current edifice, had been consumed by the fires of the Nika riots. In its place, Justinian demanded something that defied the laws of physics. He did not merely want a building, he wanted a miracle. To achieve this, he bypassed the traditional methods of the Roman architects. He summoned Anthemius of Tralles, a master of geometry and mathematics, and Isidore of Miletus, a brilliant physicist. These were not merely builders, they were theorists who understood the hidden language of shapes and light. Their goal was to solve the ultimate architectural riddle: how to place a massive, circular dome atop a square base. In the ancient world, this was a feat thought impossible without the structure collapsing under its own immense weight. The construction was a feverish, high-stakes race. Tens of thousands of laborers, stonemasons, and artisans descended upon the capital. Materials were summoned from the furthest reaches of the known world: columns of porphyry from Egypt, green marble from Thessaly, and massive blocks of limestone from the Anatolian plateau. The empire's wealth, extracted from the very provinces Belisarius was fighting to reclaim, flowed directly into the foundations of this singular project. When the scaffolding finally fell away, the result was the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. It was a revelation. As the sunlight filtered through the ring of 40 windows at the dome's base, the massive ceiling appeared to be suspended from heaven by a golden chain, rather than resting on solid walls. The interior was a kaleidoscope of shimmering mosaics and vast, open spaces that made the individual feel both infinitesimal and divine. It was a space where the material world seemed to dissolve into the spiritual. For the people of Constantinople, the Hagia Sophia was more than a cathedral. It was proof of divine favor. It was the physical manifestation of the Byzantine identity, a synthesis of Roman engineering, Greek intellect, and Christian mysticism. It stood as a defiant statement to the world. The Roman Empire had not merely survived, it had been reborn, more radiant and more formidable than ever before. But as the gold leaf dried on the icons and the incense filled the nave, a new shadow was gathering. The triumph of the Hagia Sophia marked the zenith of Justinian's reign, a moment of supreme glory that stood in stark contrast to the fragility of the empire. For while the dome reached toward the heavens, the earth beneath it was already beginning to shift. The cost of such greatness was immense, and the biological and political storms of the age were already gathering on the horizon. 541 AD, Constantinople. The golden era of Justinian was not ended by a barbarian horde or a sudden coup, but by an invisible, silent enemy that moved through the empire's very veins. As the empire reached its absolute zenith, as its borders stretched from the Pillars of Hercules to the banks of the Euphrates, a darkness arrived. It did not come with the thunder of catapults, but with the quiet scratching of rats and the frantic heartbeat of flea-ridden travelers. This was the arrival of the Yersinia pestes, the bacterium that would trigger the plague of Justinian, the first recorded pandemic of the bubonic plague in human history. The infection traveled along the very arteries that made the empire great, the Mediterranean trade routes. From the grain ships of Egypt to the bustling ports of the Levant, the plague rode the currents of commerce. It struck first in the breadbasket of the empire, Egypt, and swept upward through the maritime network, racing toward the heart of the world, Constantinople. The horror was unprecedented. Contemporary chroniclers, such as Procopius, described a nightmare that defied human comprehension. The symptoms were gruesome, sudden, agonizing swellings in the groin and armpits known as buboes, followed by high fever, vomiting of blood, and the rapid onset of death. In the crowded, labyrinthine streets of the capital, the scale of the mortality was so vast that the living could no longer keep pace with the dead. At its peak, it is estimated that Constantinople lost thousands of people every single day. The city, once the glittering jewel of the Mediterranean, became a vast, open-air morgue. The bureaucracy froze, the markets emptied, the very rhythm of Roman life stuttered and stopped. The imperial administration struggled to manage the mountains of corpses, and eventually the state resorted to mass graves, digging great pits to swallow the remains of the nameless thousands. But the catastrophe was more than a humanitarian tragedy. It was a geopolitical earthquake. The plague struck at the precise moment when Justinian's dream of a reunited Roman Empire was at its most vulnerable. The grand reconquest led by Belisarius required three things: men, money, and stability. The plague systematically stripped all three away. The legions, once the unstoppable hammer of the empire, were hollowed out. Recruitment plummeted as the pool of healthy young men evaporated. The tax base, the lifeblood of the Byzantine state, crumbled as entire villages were wiped off the map, leaving no one to till the soil or pay the imperial tithe. The staggering wealth required to maintain garrisons in Italy, North Africa, and Spain vanished into the void of mass graves. The momentum of the Reconquista ground to a halt. The ambitious expansion that had seemed inevitable just years prior was suddenly paralyzed. The empire found itself no longer an aggressor, but a survivor, forced to retreat into a defensive posture just to maintain what little it had left. The plague of Justinian proved that even the mightiest of empires, with its soaring domes and unbreakable walls, was ultimately subject to the whims of nature. The biological catastrophe did more than kill millions. It broke the back of the Roman dream. The era of expansion was over. The era of survival had begun. 534 AD, Constantinople. While the plague was a force of chaos that threatened to tear the social fabric of the empire apart, Justinian sought to impose a different kind of order, one that was not written in blood or bone, but in ink and parchment. If the plague was the shadow falling across the empire, then the law was the light Justinian intended to use to guide it through the darkness. For centuries, Roman law had been a sprawling, tangled thicket of contradictory edicts, ancient customs, and overlapping imperial decrees. It was a legal labyrinth that was nearly impossible for even the most seasoned jurists to navigate. As the empire expanded and transformed, this legal chaos became a liability. An empire cannot stand if its citizens, its merchants, and its soldiers do not know the rules by which they are governed. Justinian understood that to rule a reunited Roman world, he needed a unified Roman law. He embarked on a monumental task of legal purification, commissioning a group of elite jurists, led by the brilliant Tribonian, to perform a feat of intellectual engineering that would change the course of history. This was the birth of the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. It was not merely a collection of rules, but a systematic distillation of a millennium of Roman legal thought. The project was divided into several key components. First, the Codex, which gathered all the valid imperial edicts into a single, coherent volume. Second, the Digesta, or the Digest, a massive encyclopedia that distilled the wisdom of the great Roman jurists of the past, preserving centuries of legal reasoning. Then came the institutions, a textbook designed to teach law to the next generation of bureaucrats and lawyers. Finally, the Noveli, the new laws issued by Justinian himself as the empire evolved. The scale of this undertaking was staggering. Thousands of years of legal tradition were sifted, edited, and reorganized. What emerged was a masterpiece of logic and clarity. The Corpus Juris Civilis provided a framework for justice that was remarkably sophisticated, dealing with everything from property rights and contracts to marriage, inheritance, and the powers of the state. But the true significance of the Code of Justinian lies not in its immediate utility to the 6th century Byzantine state, but in its immortality. While the empire's physical borders would eventually shrink and the legions would vanish, the code remained. When the Middle Ages eventually gave way to the Renaissance, the rediscovery of these texts in the great universities of Europe sparked a legal revolution. The code became the bedrock upon which the legal systems of almost every modern European nation were built. It provided the vocabulary for civil law, the concepts of personhood, and the very definition of justice that governs much of the Western world today. Justinian's ambition was to restore the glory of the Roman past, and through the code, he succeeded in a way that no general or emperor ever could. His armies would eventually fail, and his empire would eventually fall, but his laws would outlive them all. The Code of Justinian was more than a set of rules. It was the enduring architecture of civilization itself. 602 AD, the Eastern Frontier. If the Code of Justinian was the architecture of a stable civilization, it was an architecture built upon a foundation of shifting sand. For all the legal brilliance and imperial expansion of the previous decades, the Byzantine Empire remained locked in a perennial, exhausting struggle with its greatest rival in the East, the Sassanid Persian Empire. For centuries, these two superpowers had played a deadly game of cat and mouse, a cycle of war and tribute that defined the geopolitical reality of the ancient world. But in the early 7th century, this cycle escalated into a struggle that would not merely test the empire's strength, but threaten its very existence. The peace that had held for a short time following the death of Justinian was shattered by the ascension of the Sassanid king Khosrow II. Unlike his predecessors, Khosrow was not interested in mere border skirmishes or the acquisition of minor territories. He sought nothing less than the total subjugation of the Roman East. Driven by a vision of Persian hegemony, the Sassanid war machine descended upon Byzantine lands with a ferocity that the empire, still reeling from the demographic scars of the plague, was ill-prepared to meet. The onslaught was catastrophic. The Persians struck with surgical precision, carving through the Levant and the rich provinces of Syria. Major cities, once the jewels of the Roman East, fell one by one. By the time the dust of the initial invasions settled, the empire found itself in a state of strategic nightmare. The fertile lands of Egypt and the Levant, the economic heartbeats of the Mediterranean, were increasingly vulnerable, and the Byzantine military was being pushed back into the Anatolian highlands. This was no longer a war of conquest. It was a war of annihilation. The Sassanids pushed deeper and deeper, their cavalry sweeping across the landscape, their siege engines battering the fortifications of once impregnable cities. The Byzantine emperors, trapped between a collapsing frontier and an empty treasury, were forced into a desperate, high-stakes gambit. They fought with the tenacity of a cornered animal, utilizing every resource, every diplomatic maneuver, and every scrap of remaining military might to stem the tide. Yet, as the years bled into a decade of unrelenting bloodshed, a grim realization began to dawn upon the halls of Constantinople. The empire was fighting a war of attrition that it could not win. The resources required to defend the East were being drained to the point of exhaustion, leaving the empire hollowed out and fragile. The very structure of the Byzantine state, its economy, its manpower, and its social cohesion, was being ground down by the relentless gears of the Persian war machine. As the 6th century gave way to the 7th, the Byzantine-Sassanid War emerged as the ultimate crucible. It was a conflict of titans, a clash of civilizations that exhausted both sides to their absolute limits. The Byzantines fought not just for territory, but for the right to exist as a sovereign power. But as they stared into the abyss of Persian dominance, they were unaware that a new, even more formidable shadow was gathering on the horizon, a shadow that would arrive just as the two empires stood, broken and bleeding, amidst the ruins of their long and terrible struggle. 632 AD, the Arabian Peninsula. Just as the Byzantine and Sassanid empires reached the absolute limits of their endurance, a new force emerged from the scorched sands of the south. It was not a slow-moving tide, but a lightning strike. From the unified tribes of Arabia rose the caliphate, propelled by a religious fervor and a military dynamism that neither the Romans nor the Persians had ever encountered. Under the leadership of the Rashidun caliphs, the armies of Islam did not merely seek to contest borders, they sought to reshape the world. The timing could not have been more catastrophic for Constantinople. The Byzantine-Sassanid War had left the Roman East a hollow shell. Its armies were depleted, its treasuries were bankrupt, and its provincial populations were fractured by religious schisms and decades of heavy taxation. The empire was a wounded giant, and the caliphate was a predator that had arrived at the moment of its greatest weakness. The collapse began with a speed that defied contemporary logic. In the early 630s, Muslim commanders like Khalid ibn al-Walid began their surge into the Levant. The Byzantine defenses, once thought impregnable, crumbled under the pressure of highly mobile light cavalry that could strike and vanish before the heavy Roman infantry could even deploy. The Battle of Yarmouk in 636 AD served as the decisive death knell for Roman authority in the Levant. In a single, brutal engagement, the Byzantine field army was shattered, leaving the gates of Syria and Palestine wide open. But the loss of the Levant was only the beginning of a cascading disaster. With the Levant broken, the path to the empire's most vital province, Egypt, lay undefended. Egypt was more than just a territory. It was the breadbasket of the empire. Its grain fueled the streets of Constantinople, and its tax revenues funded the imperial bureaucracy. When the Muslim armies swept into the Nile Delta in the 640s, the loss was felt instantly in the heart of the empire. The fall of Alexandria, the great intellectual and commercial hub of the Mediterranean, signaled that the Roman era in Africa was effectively over. The momentum of the caliphate showed no signs of slowing. Following the conquest of Egypt, the armies pushed westward, sweeping across the North African coast. The Byzantine presence in Africa, which had been painstakingly rebuilt by Justinian decades earlier, vanished almost overnight. From the sands of Libya to the shores of Carthage, the old Roman order was being replaced by a new, rapidly expanding Islamic civilization. In less than 2 decades, the geopolitical map of the world had been irrevocably redrawn. The Byzantine Empire, once a sprawling superpower that bridged the Mediterranean, had been stripped of its wealthiest and most populous provinces. The loss of the Levant, Egypt, and North Africa was not merely a territorial setback, it was a systemic amputation. The empire had been reduced from a global hegemon to a regional power, its survival now precariously tethered to the rugged highlands of Anatolia and the massive, ironclad walls of Constantinople. The era of Roman Mediterranean dominance was dead. The era of Byzantine survival had begun. 674 AD. The walls of Constantinople. The catastrophe had reached its logical, terrifying conclusion. The Arab armies, having swallowed the Levant, Egypt, and North Africa, now turned their eyes toward the ultimate prize, the Queen of Cities itself. For the Byzantines, this was no longer a war of border skirmishes or provincial administration. This was an existential struggle. If the walls of Constantinople fell, the Roman flame would be extinguished forever. The siege began not with a sudden crash, but with a slow, grinding strangulation. The Umayyad Caliphate, the successor to the Rashidun, arrived at the Golden Horn, and the land walls with a force that dwarfed anything the empire had seen in centuries. They brought with them a massive fleet of ships and a land army capable of sustained, relentless pressure. For the first time in its history, the empire was being attacked from both the sea and the land simultaneously, creating a double-sided vice designed to crush the life out of the capital. For months, the city held. The Theodosian walls, those massive, triple-layered engineering marvels that had stood for 300 years, bore the brunt of the assault. The Arab forces threw themselves against the limestone and brick, attempting to scale the battlements and breach the gates, but the Roman defenses remained stubbornly unbroken. From atop the towers, Byzantine archers and catapult crews rained death upon the attackers, turning the approach to the walls into a killing field. However, the greatest threat was not the sword, but the blockade. The Arab fleet patrolled the waters, attempting to sever the city's maritime lifelines. Constantinople was a city that lived by the sea. Without the constant flow of ships bringing grain, oil, and supplies, the population would starve long before the walls were breached. The tension in the streets was palpable. Famine, disease, and the psychological weight of being surrounded by a seemingly unstoppable tide began to erode the spirit of the defenders. But the Byzantines possessed a secret weapon, a technological terror that the Caliphate had not anticipated. Emerging from the waves like a mythological beast was Greek fire. This liquid incendiary, a closely guarded imperial secret, was projected through siphons onto enemy vessels. It was a substance that burned even on the surface of the water, a chemical nightmare that turned the sea itself into a furnace. In the naval engagements within the Golden Horn, Greek fire proved decisive, incinerating the Umayyad fleet and breaking the naval blockade that threatened to starve the city into submission. The siege dragged on for years, transitioning from a massive assault into a war of attrition. The Arab armies, far from their supply bases and struggling with the logistics of a prolonged investment, began to falter. The Byzantine resilience, bolstered by the miraculous defense of the walls and the terrifying efficacy of their secret weaponry, turned the tide. When the Arab forces finally withdrew, the empire had achieved the impossible. They had stared into the abyss of total annihilation and refused to blink. The walls had held. The city had survived. But while the immediate threat had passed, the world had changed forever. The Byzantine Empire was no longer a sprawling hegemon. It was a fortress state, a lonely bastion of Christianity and Greco-Roman tradition standing guard against a new, rising tide of Islam. The survival was miraculous, but the cost of this resilience would define the centuries to come. 726 AD, Constantinople. The survival of the empire had been secured by fire and stone, but a new, more insidious conflict was beginning to smolder within the very heart of the Byzantine soul. It would not be fought with catapults or Greek fire, but with theology, ink, and the fury of the mob. This was the iconoclastic controversy, a religious civil war that would tear the fabric of the empire apart for over a century. To understand this crisis, one must understand the psychological state of the Byzantines. The empire had been battered, broken, and stripped of its wealthiest provinces. As the Arab caliphates expanded, the Byzantines looked to the heavens for answers. Why was God allowing the cross to be besieged by the crescent? Why, despite their devotion, did the enemies of Christ seem to prosper? Into this climate of fear and divine interrogation stepped Emperor Leo III. A soldier emperor forged in the crucible of the frontier, Leo viewed the empire's recent catastrophes not as mere military failures, but as divine punishment. He looked at the ubiquitous presence of icons, the sacred images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, and saw a spiritual rot. To Leo and many of his contemporaries, the veneration of these images bordered on idolatry, a violation of the second commandment that had provoked the wrath of God. In 726, the spark was struck. Imperial edicts were issued commanding the removal of sacred images from churches. What followed was not a peaceful reform, but a violent purge. Imperial agents descended upon monasteries and parish churches, smashing centuries-old mosaics, stripping gold-leafed icons, and defacing the faces of saints on the very walls of the Hagia Sophia. The response was visceral. For the common people, the icon was not merely a piece of wood or paint. It was a window to the divine, a tangible connection to the holy. To destroy an icon was to attempt to blind the eyes of heaven itself. In the streets of Constantinople, the tension escalated into riots. Monks, the most fervent defenders of the icons, became the frontline soldiers of this spiritual insurgency, defying imperial authority at the risk of mutilation or death. The controversy split the empire into two warring camps: the iconoclasts or image breakers, who held the support of the emperors and much of the military, and the iconodules or image venerators, who found sanctuary in the monasteries and the hearts of the populace. This was more than a debate over art. It was a struggle over the nature of power. Who had the ultimate authority over the soul of the empire? The emperor, who ruled by divine right, or the church, which guarded the mysteries of the faith? The conflict would cycle through dynasties, with each new ruler attempting to swing the pendulum of orthodoxy. There would be periods of intense destruction, followed by brief eras of restoration, creating a pendulum of religious instability that weakened the empire's internal cohesion just when it needed unity most. The iconoclastic controversy left the Byzantine world deeply scarred, creating a rift between the East and the West that would eventually contribute to the Great Schism, forever altering the course of Christian history. 750 AD, the Anatolian frontier. While the streets of Constantinople echoed with the screams of rioters and the sound of hammers smashing sacred icons, a much quieter, more pragmatic revolution was taking place in the provinces. For the Byzantine Empire, the crisis was twofold. It was fighting a spiritual war for its soul and a physical war for its very existence. The Arab caliphates had seized the breadbasket of Egypt and the riches of the Levant, leaving the empire a hollowed-out shell of its former self. The old Roman way of war, a professional, centralized army paid for by a massive, centralized treasury, was no longer sustainable. The gold was gone, and the borders were too vast to defend with a single, distant legion. To survive, the empire had to undergo a radical metamorphosis. It had to stop acting like a sprawling empire and start acting like a fortified fortress. This was the birth of the theme system. The concept was as elegant as it was desperate. The empire was divided into administrative districts known as themata, or themes. But these were not merely political subdivisions. They were military zones. In a stroke of administrative genius, the distinction between civilian and soldier was erased. The land itself became the paymaster. Under this new system, the state granted parcels of land to groups of soldiers. In exchange for this land, these men, the stratiati, were obligated to serve in the imperial army whenever called upon. They were no longer distant mercenaries or professional soldiers waiting for a paycheck from a depleted treasury in Constantinople. They were farmer soldiers. They were men defending their own soil, their own crops, and their own families. This shift changed the very DNA of Byzantine defense. It created a deep, personal stake in the survival of the state. When an Arab raiding party crossed the Taurus Mountains into Anatolia, they weren't just attacking a distant emperor. They were attacking the homes and livelihoods of the local militia. The theme system turned every province into a layer of defense, creating a decentralized, resilient web of resistance that could absorb shocks that would have shattered the old Roman model. However, this survival mechanism came with a heavy price. By tying military power to the land, the empire inadvertently created a new and dangerous class, the provincial military aristocracy. As these soldier farmers became more successful, their families grew into powerful landowning dynasties. These theme commanders, or strategoi, possessed not just the loyalty of their men, but the economic power to challenge the throne itself. The theme system was a brilliant, jagged solution to an existential threat. It provided the manpower and the local resilience necessary to halt the Islamic expansion and stabilize the borders. It allowed the empire to endure its darkest centuries, transforming a collapsing superpower into a lean, militarized state. But in solving the problem of external conquest, it planted the seeds of internal instability. A tension between the central authority of the emperor and the rising power of the provincial generals that would haunt the Byzantine political landscape for centuries to come. 750 AD, the Anatolian frontier. The smoke from burned villages and the scarred landscapes of the borderlands tell a story of a world in flux. If the theme system was the armor the empire donned to survive the onslaught of the caliphates, then the period that followed was the long, grueling process of learning to breathe inside that armor. This was the era of the Byzantine Dark Ages, not a period of total darkness, but one of profound contraction and radical transformation. To understand this era, one must look at the maps. The sprawling, sun-drenched expanse of Justinian's dream had vanished. In its place was a leaner, harder, and more isolated state. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake that facilitated trade and rapid troop movement, had become a contested battleground. The sea was no longer a highway for commerce, but a corridor for Arab raids. The once interconnected world of the late antique Mediterranean was fracturing into isolated pockets of survival. This contraction forced a psychological shift within the Byzantine identity. The old Roman identity, focused on universal dominion and the administrative sprawl of a global superpower, began to recede. In its place emerged something more concentrated, more intensely Greek and more deeply Christian. The empire was no longer an empire of many nations. It was becoming a besieged Christian bastion. This period saw the solidification of the Byzantine spirit, a culture defined by its ability to endure, to hold the line, and to find strength in its own isolation. Economically, the empire was forced into a state of forced austerity. With the loss of the wealthy provinces of Egypt and Syria, the tax base collapsed. The grand, marble-clad cities of the interior began to shrink. Many ancient urban centers were abandoned or reduced to fortified citadels. The economy moved away from the vast, complex networks of international trade and toward a more localized, agrarian model. Life became centered around the fortified town and the village, where the rhythm of the seasons was dictated by the constant, looming threat of the frontier. Yet within this contraction, a new kind of resilience was forged. While the borders were being pushed back, the internal structures of the state were being hardened. The bureaucracy in Constantinople became more streamlined, more efficient, and more obsessed with survival. The Church, having survived the fires of the iconoclastic controversy, became the primary glue holding the fractured society together. Religion was no longer just a pillar of the state. It became the very language through which the Byzantines understood their suffering and their survival. They began to view their struggles not as mere political failures, but as divine tests, a crucible designed to refine the faithful. By the end of this period, the Byzantine Empire was unrecognizable from the Rome of old. It was smaller, poorer, and more defensive, but it was also more cohesive. The transformation was complete. The sprawling, diverse Roman Empire had died, and in its place, the compact, militarized, and intensely religious Byzantine state had been born. The empire had survived its darkest hour, not by reclaiming its past, but by reinventing itself for an uncertain future. The foundation was set for a resurgence, but the shadows of the provincial generals and the scars of the lost provinces remained, waiting to shape the next great chapter of history. 867 AD, Constantinople. The era of survival was over. The era of resurgence had begun. For nearly 2 centuries, the empire had existed in a state of defensive crouch, a wounded animal waiting for the predator to strike. But as the dust settled on the iconoclastic controversies and the Arab raids stabilized into a manageable, if deadly, stalemate, a new force began to stir within the heart of the imperial administration. This was not the old, sprawling Roman aristocracy, but a new breed of leader, the military aristocrats of the Anatolian themes, men who had grown up in the shadow of the frontier and understood the cost of weakness. The catalyst for this transformation was a man of profound ambition and questionable legitimacy. Basil I, a peasant-born soldier who had risen through the ranks to become the lover and eventually the co-emperor of Michael III. Basil's ascent to the throne marked the birth of the Macedonian dynasty. He did not merely inherit a state. He inherited a machine that had been rebuilt for war. The Dark Ages had done their work. The empire was no longer a bloated, overextended giant. It was a compact, highly disciplined, and culturally unified military powerhouse. Under the Macedonians, the Byzantine identity underwent a second, even more glorious evolution. If the previous centuries were about survival, The Macedonian era was about excellence. The empire began to project an image of overwhelming prestige. This was the Macedonian Renaissance, a period where the intellect of the ancient Greeks was systematically rediscovered, codified, and woven into the fabric of Christian governance. Scholars, poets, and theologians flocked to Constantinople, turning the city once again into the intellectual lighthouse of the medieval world. The empire was no longer just holding the line, it was reclaiming its right to lead civilization. But this cultural flowering was backed by a terrifyingly efficient military engine. The Macedonian emperors transformed the theme system from a defensive necessity into an offensive weapon. They professionalized the imperial army, blending the grit of the provincial thematic troops with the elite, heavy cavalry of the tagmata, the professional standing regiments stationed near the capital. For the first time in generations, the Byzantine eagle was not just watching the horizon for invaders, it was preparing to fly. The geopolitical landscape began to shift in Constantinople's favor. To the east, the Abbasid Caliphate began to fracture, creating power vacuums that Byzantine diplomacy and steel were eager to fill. To the west, the Bulgarian Empire emerged as a formidable rival, a shadow looming over the Balkan provinces. The Macedonian emperors understood that to secure the empire, they could not merely defend their borders, they had to expand them. They would use a sophisticated blend of soft power, marriage alliances, the export of orthodoxy, and the sheer gravity of Byzantine gold, alongside the hard power of organized, relentless conquest. As the dynasty took root, the fundamental character of the state changed once more. The empire had transitioned from a besieged bastion into a predatory superpower. The economy was recovering, the borders were pushing outward, and the light of Greek learning was burning brighter than it had since the days of antiquity. The stage was set for a century of dominance, a golden age that would see the empire reach its true medieval zenith. The shadow of the eagle was stretching once again across the Mediterranean, and the world was about to remember what it meant to live under the rule of Rome. 976 AD, the Balkan frontier. As the Macedonian dynasty reached its maturity, the shadow of the eagle was no longer merely stretching, it was beginning to strike. While the eastern borders were being stabilized through diplomacy and tactical strikes against the caliphate, a much more visceral, existential threat loomed in the west. The First Bulgarian Empire, under the formidable Tsar Samuel, had become a predator in its own right. This was not a mere border skirmish or a raid for tribute. This was a struggle for the very soul of the Balkans. The Bulgars had carved out a powerful, centralized state that challenged Byzantine hegemony, seizing territories that had once been Roman and threatening the security of the Thracian heartlands. Into this atmosphere of high-stakes geopolitics stepped a man who would define the era, Basil II. He did not ascend the throne with the easy grace of a born prince. His early reign was marred by civil wars and the treachery of the very military aristocracy that had brought his dynasty to power. He was a man forged in the fires of internal strife, a ruler who learned early on that an emperor could trust neither the ambitious generals of the themes nor the fickle whims of the court. This hardened him. It turned him into a man of singular, almost monastic focus, a soldier emperor who preferred the saddle of a war horse to the silken cushions of the great palace. The war with Bulgaria would become the defining crucible of his life. For decades, the conflict descended into a brutal, grinding war of attrition. It was a landscape of mountain passes, fortified strongholds, and sudden, bloody ambushes. Tsar Samuel was a master of guerrilla warfare, using the rugged Balkan terrain to neutralize the Byzantine advantage in heavy cavalry. For years, the empire fought a war of shadows, where victories were hard-won and territory was gained only to be lost in the next winter frost. Basil II did not seek the quick, glorious triumph of his predecessors. He sought the systematic, relentless dismantling of his enemy. The turning point arrived in the early 11th century. Through a series of grueling campaigns, Basil began to choke the Bulgarian resistance, isolating their fortresses one by one. But it was the Battle of Claudion in 1014 that would etch his name into the dark annals of history forever. In a moment of tactical brilliance and terrifying ruthlessness, the Byzantine forces broke the Bulgarian lines. Legend tells us that Basil, seeing the scale of his victory, enacted a punishment so severe it would haunt the collective memory of the Balkans for centuries. He captured thousands of Bulgarian soldiers and, according to the chroniclers, blinded them all, leaving one man in every 100 with a single eye to lead the others back to their czar. When the news of this carnage reached Tsar Samuel, the shock was said to have killed him. The Bulgarian resistance shattered. By 1018, the Bulgarian Empire was no more, its lands fully reintegrated into the Byzantine fold. This was the zenith of Macedonian power. The Balkans were once again under the Roman eagle, and Basil II had transformed from a struggling monarch into a legend. He earned a title that was both a testament to his victory and a warning to his enemies, Bulgaroktonos, the Bulgar Slayer. The empire had reached its true medieval peak, a superpower that commanded the respect, the fear, and the absolute submission of the known world. 1018 AD, the Balkan Peninsula. With the fall of the Bulgarian resistance, the map of Europe was irrevocably altered. The once fractured landscape of the Balkans, a patchwork of competing principalities and raiding tribes, had been hammered into submission by the relentless iron will of a single man. The reintegration of these territories was not merely a territorial gain. It was a resurrection of Roman authority in the West. For the first time in centuries, the Byzantine Empire was not merely surviving the pressure of its neighbors. It was dictating the terms of existence to them. This was the true zenith of the Macedonian dynasty. Under Basil II, the Byzantine military machine had been refined into a weapon of unparalleled precision. The era of the thematic levies, once prone to local corruption and political infighting, had been augmented by a professional, highly disciplined corps of imperial troops. The synergy between the sophisticated bureaucracy of Constantinople and the battle-hardened veterans of the frontiers created a state that functioned with the terrifying efficiency of a well-oiled engine. The empire was no longer a defensive shell. It was an expansive, predatory superpower. But the strength of the empire under Basil was not found solely in the sharpness of its swords, but in the depth of its reach. To the east, the borders were secured through a complex web of vassalage and strategic fortresses, ensuring that the resurgence of Islamic powers would be met with a wall of steel. To the west, the Danube once again served as a Roman river, a boundary that protected the heartlands of Thrace and Macedonia. The Mediterranean had become, in many practical senses, a Byzantine lake, facilitating a flow of wealth, culture, and grain that fueled a new era of imperial splendor. This was the golden age of the Macedonian Renaissance. As the borders expanded, So too did the influence of the great palace. The wealth flowing into Constantinople from the newly conquered provinces financed a massive cultural flowering. The arts, theology, and classical Greek scholarship underwent a profound revival. The empire was not just a military juggernaut, it was the intellectual and spiritual lighthouse of the Christian world. To be a scholar, a monk, or a diplomat in the 11th century was to gravitate toward the gravity well of Constantinople, the undisputed center of the civilized universe. Yet this peak was a precarious one. The very success of Basil II's reign created the conditions for future instability. By crushing the Bulgarian threat and centralizing power so absolutely within the person of the emperor, he left a vacuum that would eventually be filled by the ambitious landed aristocracy. The military success had been built on the back of a ruler of extraordinary, almost superhuman, discipline. As the Macedonian line moved toward its sunset, the question remained: could the empire survive a ruler who lacked the iron soul of the Bulgar slayer? For a brief, shining moment, however, the answer was a resounding yes. The shadow of the eagle was at its longest, stretching from the shores of the Adriatic to the gates of the Caucasus. The Byzantine Empire stood as the ultimate heir to Rome, a state that had mastered the art of war, the intricacies of diplomacy, and the majesty of divine rule. It was a superpower at its absolute height, a colossus that seemed, to all observers of the age, as though it might endure forever. 950 AD, Constantinople. While the thunder of Basil II's legions echoed across the Balkan mountains, a different kind of conquest was taking place within the marble halls and scriptoria of the capital. If the sword had reclaimed the empire's territory, it was the pen and the brush that reclaimed its soul. This was the heart of the Macedonian Renaissance, a period where the Byzantine identity underwent a profound metamorphosis, shedding the scars of the previous century's struggles to embrace a new, sophisticated brilliance. For generations, the empire had been forced into a defensive crouch, preoccupied by survival. But as the Macedonian emperors stabilized the frontiers, they turned their gaze inward, toward the ghosts of the past. There was a sudden, feverish hunger to reconnect with the classical heritage that had once been the bedrock of Mediterranean civilization. The scholars of Constantinople did not merely want to preserve the works of Plato, Aristotle, and Homer. They sought to master them, to comment upon them, and to weave their ancient wisdom into the fabric of Christian orthodoxy. In the great libraries and monastic cells, a massive intellectual project was underway. Scribes worked by candlelight to transcribe, correct, and preserve the fading manuscripts of antiquity. This was not a blind imitation of the Greeks of old, but a living synthesis. The Byzantines were taking the logic of the ancients and the philosophy of the Hellenistic world and refining them through the lens of Byzantine theology. This intellectual revival produced a new class of highly educated bureaucrats and diplomats, men who could quote Sophocles in one breath and discuss the nuances of the Holy Trinity in the next. This soft power became as potent as any legion. Through their mastery of rhetoric and law, the Byzantines could outmaneuver their neighbors without ever drawing a blade. This intellectual awakening found its most breathtaking expression in the visual arts. The era saw a departure from the rigid, austere styles of the dark centuries toward a new sense of elegance, grace, and spiritual depth. In the churches of the capital, the walls began to breathe with color. Mosaics, crafted from tesserae of gold and precious glass, were no longer just decorations. They were windows into the divine. The figures became more lifelike. their expressions imbued with a profound, quiet humanity that bridged the gap between the earthly and the celestial. Painting and sculpture underwent a similar transformation. The influence of classical naturalism began to bleed back into religious iconography, creating a style that was both deeply pious and aesthetically sophisticated. Every icon, every fresco, and every illuminated manuscript was a testament to this renewed confidence. The empire was telling the world, and itself, that it was not merely a remnant of a fallen Rome, but the true, living heir to the entire legacy of Greek and Roman achievement. This cultural flowering was the ultimate expression of Byzantine legitimacy. By patronizing the arts and the sciences, the Macedonian emperors were asserting that Constantinople was the only true center of civilization. They were building a legacy of beauty that was intended to be as eternal as the empire itself. For a time, the splendor of the arts and the brilliance of the intellect provided a golden veneer that masked the growing political tensions beneath, creating an era of unmatched majesty that remains the most luminous chapter in the history of the East. 975 AD, Constantinople. But if the Macedonian Renaissance was the soul of the empire, then diplomacy was its nervous system. While the poets sang of beauty and the scholars debated the divine, the imperial court was engaged in a much more pragmatic, and perhaps more cynical, form of warfare. The Byzantines had learned a lesson that many empires fail to grasp. A war won by the sword is expensive, bloody, and temporary, but a peace bought with gold and bloodlines is enduring. This was the era of the diplomacy of gold. To the outside world, the Byzantine Empire was not merely a state, but a shimmering, semi-divine entity. The emperors did not just rule, they presided over a cosmic order. And to maintain this order, they utilized a sophisticated machinery of soft power designed to turn potential enemies into clients and rivals into kin. At the heart of this strategy was the imperial treasury. The Byzantine nomisma, a gold coin of such consistent purity and weight that it became the dollar of the Middle Ages, acted as a silent legion. Through a complex web of subsidies, tributes, and gifts, Constantinople could effectively buy the loyalty of barbarian chieftains, bribe enemy generals to defect, or fund a rival tribe to attack a neighbor. It was a way of fighting wars without ever mobilizing a single regiment. If a border tribe became restless, the solution was often not a campaign of annihilation, but a chest of gold and a title of nobility. By integrating these outsiders into the Byzantine hierarchy, the empire transformed them from existential threats into paid protectors of the frontier. However, gold could only buy so much loyalty. To truly bind a foreign power to the fate of the eagle, the Byzantines turned to the most intimate of alliances, marriage. In the gilded halls of the great palace, marriage was never about romance. It was a calculated instrument of statecraft. The princesses of the Macedonian dynasty were the most valuable commodities in the Mediterranean. To marry a Byzantine princess was to be touched by the divine. It was to enter the orbit of the true Roman emperor. These unions were carefully orchestrated to create a web of Byzantine-aligned dynasties across Europe and the Near East. Through these matrimonial ties, the empire exerted a subtle, creeping influence. A Bulgarian czar or a Kievan prince might rule his own lands, but if his queen was a daughter of Constantinople, his court would begin to mirror the splendor of the capital. His language would become more Greek, his liturgy would become more orthodox, his political ambitions would become inextricably linked to the interests of the emperor. This was the ultimate victory, the conquest of the mind and the bloodline. Yet this diplomacy was a delicate balancing act. To grant a marriage alliance to a barbarian was often seen by the Byzantine aristocracy as a dilution of their sacred blood. It was a tension between the necessity of survival and the pride of Roman identity. But as the Macedonian era reached its zenith, this strategy proved remarkably successful. The empire had created a world where Constantinople was the sun, and all other courts, no matter how powerful, were merely planets caught in its golden, inescapable gravity. 1025 AD, Constantinople. The sun sets on the reign of Basil the Bulgar Slayer, and as the dust of his relentless campaign settles, a profound silence falls over the Mediterranean and the Balkans. For the first time in centuries, the Roman world is not merely surviving, it is thriving. The shadows cast by the double-headed eagle have stretched across the known world, covering a landscape that is once again unified, prosperous, and deeply, undeniably Roman. This is the zenith. This is the empire at its peak. To understand the world under the shadow of the eagle, one must look beyond the walls of Constantinople and see the sheer scale of the Macedonian restoration. To the west, the remnants of the old European order look toward the east with a mixture of awe and envy. To the north, the once terrifying Bulgar tribes who had once threatened to extinguish the Roman flame have been tamed, integrated, and brought into the fold of the Orthodox faith. The Balkans, once a chaotic frontier of raiding warbands, have become a stabilized buffer zone, a garden of Byzantine influence where the liturgy and the law of the emperor flow like rivers. In the east, the landscape has shifted fundamentally. The long, exhausting struggle with the Islamic caliphates has reached a state of strategic equilibrium. The Byzantine frontiers are no longer porous lines of weakness, but fortified bastions of strength. The themes, the military provinces that had been forged in the fires of the Dark Ages, are now filled with prosperous, landed soldier farmers who possess both the will and the means to defend the imperial soil. Anatolia, the very heart of the empire's manpower, is breathing once again, its cities teeming with trade and its fields heavy with grain. But the peak of the empire was not defined solely by the reach of its armies, but by the depth of its sophistication. This was a world of staggering contrast. In the provinces, life moved to the rhythm of the seasons and the tolling of church bells, yet even the smallest market town felt the gravitational pull of the capital. The Byzantine economy was the engine of the medieval world. The silk trade, the spice routes, and the maritime networks of the Aegean created a flow of wealth that was unparalleled. To trade in the Mediterranean was to participate in the Byzantine system. To prosper was to acknowledge the supremacy of the emperor. Culturally, the empire was experiencing a second flowering, a renaissance that rivaled the classical age of antiquity. The libraries of Constantinople were overflowing with the wisdom of Plato, Aristotle, and Homer, preserved and curated by scholars who saw themselves as the true heirs to Greek civilization. This was a period of High Byzantium, where art, architecture, and philosophy were not merely pursuits of the elite, but instruments of imperial prestige. The mosaics that adorned the churches were not just decorations. They were windows into the divine, designed to remind every viewer that the earthly empire was a mirror of the kingdom of heaven. As the year 1025 dawns, the empire stands as a monolith of stability in a fractured world. It is a superpower of intellect, of gold, and of steel. The eagle is perched high, its eyes surveying a realm that feels, for one brief and shimmering moment, eternal. But history teaches us that the higher the peak, the more precipitous the slope. The question is no longer whether the empire can survive, but how long it can hold this magnificent, heavy crown. 1025 AD, Constantinople. The golden era of the Macedonian dynasty has reached its twilight, and with the death of Basil II, the heavy crown of the Roman Empire passes into a vacuum of stability. For decades, the strength of the state had rested upon the iron will of a single man, a ruler who had suppressed the ambitions of the great families and replenished the imperial coffers through conquest. But Basil was an anomaly. He was a bulwark against the very forces that now, in the silence following his passing, begin to stir with a predatory hunger. The greatness of Byzantium had always been built upon a delicate, calculated tension between the emperor and the landed elite. During the dark centuries of survival, the empire relied on the theme system, a backbone of free, small-scale soldier farmers who held their land in exchange for military service. These men were the lifeblood of the state. They were loyal to the emperor, they were self-sufficient, and they provided a massive, motivated reservoir of manpower that could be mobilized at a moment's notice. They were the shield of the empire. But as the Macedonian peak gave way to the long twilight, that shield began to crack. A new class of men was rising in the shadows of the imperial court, the dynatoi, the powerful. These were the great aristocratic families, the magnates of Anatolia and the Balkans, who viewed the emperor not as a divinely appointed master, but as a peer to be managed, manipulated, or even supplanted. To the dynatoi, the smallholder was not a citizen to be protected, but an obstacle to be cleared. Using their vast wealth and growing political influence, these aristocrats began a slow, methodical strangulation of the imperial social order. They leveraged their connections in the capital to pass laws that favored the great estates, and they used their private armies to intimidate local officials. Through predatory lending, legal manipulation, and outright seizure, the dynatoi began to swallow the small holdings of the soldier farmers. Land that had once supported 1,000 loyal families was consolidated into massive, private latifundia. The consequences of this internal rot were catastrophic. As the independent farmer vanished, so too did the free soldier. The once reliable theme system, the very engine of Byzantine military resilience, began to grind to a halt. The state found itself in a fatal paradox. As the aristocracy grew wealthier and more powerful, the central government grew poorer and more fragile. The tax base was eroding, replaced by a class of elites who were often more interested in defying the emperor than in funding the defense of the realm. This was no longer a struggle of borders or religions. It was a struggle for the soul of the Roman state. The central authority in Constantinople was becoming a hollow shell, a gilded facade of power that lacked the terrestrial roots to support its own weight. The bureaucracy was increasingly filled with court eunuchs and sycophants, while the provinces were carved into personal fiefdoms by ambitious generals. The eagle was still perched high, but its talons were being pulled from beneath it. The internal machinery of the empire was being dismantled from within by the very men who claimed to be its defenders. The foundation was shifting, the social contract was breaking, and as the aristocracy consolidated its grip, the empire was unknowingly setting the stage for a vulnerability that no wall, no matter how thick, could ever truly protect. August 1071, the rugged highlands of eastern Anatolia. While the aristocrats in Constantinople played their lethal games of court intrigue, A new and terrifying shadow was lengthening across the eastern frontiers. From the vast steppes of Central Asia, a nomadic storm was gathering, the Seljuk Turks. These were not the settled armies of a rival empire, but highly mobile, horse-mounted warriors of unparalleled ferocity, unified under the banner of a rising sultanate. They moved like a tide, striking at the edges of the Byzantine frontier, raiding the very Anatolian heartland that had once been the empire's unbreakable bedrock. By the time the Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes ascended the throne, the crisis had reached a breaking point. Romanos was not a man of the court. He was a soldier, a general who understood that the empire could no longer afford the luxury of internal division. He saw the crumbling theme system and the encroaching Turkic raids for what they were, an existential threat. To save the state, he knew he had to strike a decisive blow. He would lead the imperial host into the Anatolian interior to crush the Seljuk threat once and for all. But Romanos was marching into a trap, not just of geography but of politics. As he gathered his massive army, a patchwork of seasoned thematic troops, foreign mercenaries, and the heavy cavalry of the elite, he carried with him the seeds of his own destruction. The Dinatoi, the very aristocrats who had hollowed out the empire's military strength, viewed Romanos's campaign with suspicion. To them, a successful general was a dangerous rival. Within the emperor's own ranks, shadows of betrayal were already taking root. On the morning of August 26, the two forces met near the fortress of Manzikert. The Byzantine army was a sight of terrifying splendor, thousands of armored cataphracts, shimmering in the sun, supported by disciplined infantry and a formidable contingent of Varangian guards. Facing them was the Seljuk force under Sultan Alp Arslan. They lacked the heavy armor of the Romans, but they possessed a weapon the Byzantines could not match: mobility. The battle began with the rhythmic thunder of heavy cavalry charges, but the Seljuks employed a tactic perfected on the steppes: the feigned retreat. They would charge, only to wheel away at the last moment, drawing the Byzantine lines thin and disorganized. As the Roman ranks pushed forward, lured by the prospect of a rout, the Seljuk horse archers circled like vultures, raining a constant, lethal storm of arrows upon the advancing columns. Then the fatal blow was struck. The internal rot that had begun decades earlier in the halls of Constantinople finally manifested on the battlefield. A large faction of the Byzantine army, led by the treacherous Andronikos Doukas, saw the moment of chaos and chose to abandon the emperor. Instead of reinforcing the center, Doukas' troops retreated, leaving Romanos isolated and surrounded. The imperial line buckled and broke. The invincible Roman army dissolved into a panicked mass of men fleeing through the dust. For the first time in centuries, a Byzantine emperor was captured alive on the field of battle. The defeat at Manzikert was more than a military loss. It was a tectonic shift in history. The Anatolian plateau, the empire's source of grain, its tax revenue, and its soldiers, was left wide open. The gates had been breached, and the Seljuks poured in, transforming the Byzantine heartland into a new Islamic frontier. The eagle had not just lost a battle, it had lost its wings. 1081. The Marble Halls of Constantinople. The empire was no longer a superpower. It was a wounded beast, bleeding from a dozen different wounds. Anatolia was being swallowed by Turkic tribes, the Normans were hammering at the gates in the west, and the Balkans were a chaotic patchwork of rebellion. The central authority had collapsed into a vacuum of civil war, and the once mighty Roman machinery was grinding to a halt. To many, it seemed the end was not just possible, but inevitable. The Roman sun was setting, and the long night of the Middle Ages was closing in. But from the wreckage of this chaos emerged a man of iron will, Alexios Ikomnenos. Alexios was not merely another claimant to the throne. He was a survivor. He had navigated the treacherous waters of palace coups and military betrayals to seize the purple, inheriting a state that was functionally bankrupt and militarily hollow. Yet, where his predecessors had seen only ruin, Alexios saw a foundation upon which a final, brilliant edifice could be built. This would become known as the Komnenian Restoration, a desperate, sophisticated, and ultimately magnificent attempt to hold the line against the encroaching darkness. His strategy was threefold: stabilization, professionalization, and diplomacy. First, he had to stop the bleeding. Alexios understood that the old theme system, once the backbone of Byzantine defense, was dead. In its place, he began to build a new kind of military, one reliant on highly disciplined, professional mercenary units and a refined corps of imperial cavalry, funded by a radical reorganization of the state's dwindling finances. He turned the empire's survival into a matter of elite precision, rather than massed manpower. Second, he mastered the art of the diplomacy of gold and marriage. Recognizing that Byzantium could no longer defeat its enemies through sheer force, Alexios used the empire's remaining prestige as a weapon. He played the Normans against the Pechenegs, and the Turks against the various Balkan tribes. He turned neighbors into vassals and rivals into allies through a complex web of treaties and dynastic marriages, effectively buying the time the empire so desperately needed to breathe. Third, and perhaps most pivotally, Alexios reached out to the West. In a move that would change the course of human history, he sent an appeal to the papacy, asking for aid against the Seljuk threat. This plea was the spark that ignited the First Crusade. While the arrival of the Latin Westerners brought a new set of complications and cultural frictions, it also provided the heavy shock cavalry and the sheer manpower that the Komnenian armies lacked. For a time, the crusading tide acted as a blunt instrument that Alexios skillfully redirected to serve Byzantine interests, helping to push the Turks back from the coastal fringes of Anatolia. Under the Komnenian dynasty, the empire experienced a miraculous resurgence. Cities were reclaimed, trade routes were secured, and a new era of cultural and intellectual flowering began to bloom amidst the ruins. It was a period of defiant brilliance, a final golden twilight where the Byzantine spirit refused to yield. But even as Alexios and his successors rebuilt the walls and replenished the coffers, the cracks in the foundation remained. They had successfully held the line, but they were fighting against the gravity of history itself. 1096, the rugged mountain passes of the Balkans. The request sent by Alexios Komnenos to the west had intended to summon a surgical strike, a small, manageable force of professional mercenaries to bolster the imperial armies. But what arrived instead was a tidal wave of religious fervor, uncontrolled and unpredictable. This was not the disciplined, tactical aid the emperor had envisioned. This was the First Crusade. As the massive columns of Western Latins began to spill into Byzantine territory, the atmosphere in Constantinople shifted from cautious hope to profound apprehension. These were not the polished soldiers of a professional army. They were a chaotic, sprawling mass of knights, infantry, and peasants, driven by a messianic zeal that bordered on the fanatical. To the Byzantines, these newcomers were not brothers in Christ. They were unwashed, boisterous, and dangerously volatile barbarians. The cultural chasm was immediate and jarring. The Byzantines, heirs to the sophisticated traditions of Rome and the refined theology of the Greek East, viewed the Westerners with a mixture of disdain and terror. The Latins, in turn, looked upon the Greeks as effeminate, treacherous, and even heretical. They saw a Christian empire that possessed immense wealth and magnificent cities, yet failed to defend the Holy Land with the ferocity they believed was required. To the Crusader, the Byzantines' preference for diplomacy and gold over bloody crusade was not strategy, it was cowardice. Alexios, ever the pragmatist, realized he was riding a tiger. He knew he could not stop this migration, so he sought to domesticate it. He met the Crusader leaders with a calculated display of imperial splendor, using the overwhelming majesty of Constantinople to remind them of who truly held the keys to the East. He demanded a heavy price for passage, oaths of fealty. He insisted that any lands reclaimed from the Turks must be returned to the empire. He was attempting to turn a holy war into a Byzantine reconquest. For a time, his gamble seemed to pay off. The Crusader armies, bolstered by the logistical support of the imperial administration, pushed through the Anatolian heartland. They fought with a ferocity that the Seljuk Turks had never encountered, shattering the defensive lines and carving out a series of Latin states in the Levant. For the Byzantines, this was a moment of strategic triumph. The pressure on the Anatolian coast was relieved, and the empire's borders were momentarily secured by the very chaos it had invited. However, this success was built on shifting sands. The presence of these massive, independent Western armies within the empire's borders created a permanent state of friction. The Crusaders were a state within a state, often pillaging Byzantine lands when supplies ran low and viewing imperial officials with deep suspicion. The First Crusade had achieved the impossible. It had halted the Turkish advance and provided the empire with a much-needed breathing space. But it had also introduced a new, unpredictable element into the Byzantine world. The Latin presence was a double-edged sword, a shield against the East, but a creeping infection from the West. The seeds of a much deeper, more catastrophic conflict had been sown, and the uneasy coexistence between the Greek East and the Latin West had begun its long, slow descent toward tragedy. 1204, the Golden Horn, Constantinople. The seeds of resentment sown during the First Crusade had, over a century, grown into a forest of hatred. The uneasy coexistence between the Greek East and the Latin West had finally withered away, replaced by a toxic brew of religious schism, political jealousy, and unbridled greed. The creeping infection of the West had not merely lingered, it had mutated. The catalyst for the apocalypse was not a grand theological debate, but a desperate, failed gamble. A pretender to the Byzantine throne, Alexios IV Angelos, arrived at the gates of the crusading camp with a promise that would change the course of history. If the Crusaders helped him seize the throne, he would pay them a king's ransom and unite the Eastern and Western churches under the papacy. To the leaders of the Fourth Crusade, men who were already deep in debt to the Venetian Republic and lacked the resources to reach Jerusalem, this was not a political maneuver, it was a divine windfall. They diverted their massive fleet away from the Holy Land and toward the heart of the Christian East. They were no longer pilgrims seeking the Holy Sepulchre, they were mercenaries seeking a payday. When Alexios IV was indeed installed on the throne, the dream of a unified Christendom shattered against the reality of an empty imperial treasury. He could not pay the promised sums. He could not fulfill the impossible promises. To the Crusaders, the Byzantines were no longer mere heretics. They were oath-breakers and thieves. To the people of Constantinople, the Crusaders were no longer defenders of the faith. They were a predatory swarm circling their gates. In April 1204, the tension snapped. The siege of the Queen of Cities began. The assault on the sea walls was a scene of nightmare. The Venetians, masters of maritime warfare, used their ships to scale the fortifications, while the Frankish knights pressed forward with a singular, violent purpose. For the first time in nearly 1,000 years, the invincible Theodosian walls were breached not by a foreign invader from the east, but by the very men who had once claimed to be the empire's allies. What followed was not a conquest, but a massacre. For 3 days, the great betrayal unfolded in a frenzy of sacrilege. The Crusaders, driven by a fever of plunder, tore through the streets of Constantinople. They did not distinguish between the palace and the cathedral, between the soldier and the priest. The Hagia Sophia, the very soul of the Orthodox world, was desecrated. Altars were stripped of gold, precious relics were stolen, and the sacred icons, the windows to the divine, were smashed or melted down for coin. The wealth of a millennium was systematically liquidated. Statues of ancient heroes were broken, libraries were looted, and the streets ran red with the blood of a population that had watched their world die in a matter of hours. The city of cities was being gutted by its brothers. As the smoke rose over the Golden Horn, the Byzantine Empire was effectively decapitated. The Crusaders did not just defeat an army, they shattered a civilization. They carved the empire into fragmented Latin states, establishing a regime of foreign occupiers in the very heart of the Roman world. The empire had survived the Persians, the Arabs, and the Turks, but it could not survive the betrayal of the West. The sun had set on the Roman dream, leaving only a broken, fractured shadow of what once was. 1204, the outskirts of Nicaea, Bithynia. Where Constantinople had been a world of marble, gold, and stolen glory, Nicaea was a world of dust, survival, and desperate resolve. As the smoke from the sack of the Queen of Cities drifted toward the east, the remnants of the Byzantine elite did not simply vanish. They fled. They gathered the broken pieces of an empire, the fleeing bureaucrats, the displaced clergy, and the surviving generals, and retreated into the rugged heartlands of Anatolia. The empire was no longer a continuous superpower. It was a ghost. It was a collection of fractured enclaves, a shadow kingdom clinging to the edges of a continent that had turned against it. But amidst this chaos, a spark of legitimacy survived in the Empire of Nicaea. Led by Theodore I Lascaris, the Nicaean state was born not from imperial splendor but from necessity. While the Latin Empire sat atop the ruins of Constantinople, ruling a city they could neither understand nor truly sustain, the Nicaean emperors began a monumental task: the preservation of the Roman identity in exile. They were the keepers of the flame. They held the true lineage of the Basileus, and more importantly, they held the ideological soul of the Orthodox Church. The Nicene period was defined by a singular, obsessive purpose: reconquest. This was not a period of quiet mourning, but one of intense, calculated militarism. Theodore and his successors, particularly John III Vatatzes, realized that to reclaim the capital, they first had to rebuild the foundation. They turned their eyes toward the Anatolian plateau, reclaiming territory from the Seljuk Turks and fortifying their borders. They transformed Nicaea from a mere refugee camp into a disciplined proto-state. Under Vatatzes, the Nicaean economy began to heal. He implemented strict agricultural reforms and promoted self-sufficiency, ensuring that while the West grew fat on the plunder of Constantinople, Nicaea grew strong on the grit of its own soil. He understood a fundamental truth of history. An empire cannot be won with prayers alone. It must be fed by a stable land and a loyal peasantry. Yet the geopolitical reality was a nightmare of fragmentation. To the west, the Latin occupiers held the throne. To the north, the Bulgarians posed a constant threat. And to the east, the Turks waited for any sign of weakness. The Byzantines were surrounded by enemies, both old and new. The empire was a body with its head severed, trying to learn how to walk, fight, and breathe again through its limbs. This era was a crucible. It tested whether Byzantium was merely a city, a set of walls, or a living idea. In the halls of Nicaea, the idea proved to be more resilient than the stone of Constantinople. The Nicaean emperors were not merely ruling a province. They were conducting a long, patient siege of history itself. They were waiting for the moment when the Latin dream would falter, and the Roman shadow could once again step into the light. The empire was in exile, yes, but it was an exile that was learning how to strike back. 1261, the Golden Gate, Constantinople. For 57 years, the Queen of Cities had been a hollow shell, a prize of war inhabited by a Latin elite that never truly belonged. The streets that once echoed with the footsteps of Roman emperors now rang with the clatter of Frankish knights and the tongues of Westerners. But as the sun set on the Latin occupation, a new shadow was lengthening from the east, a shadow that carried the weight of a restored legacy. The architect of this resurrection was not a traditional general, but a man of profound cunning and iron will, Michael VIII Palaiologos. Michael was a man of the shadows, a master of the political labyrinth. He understood what the previous rulers of Nicaea had learned, that reclaiming an empire required more than just a strong army. It required the perfect alignment of diplomacy, deception, and timing. As the empire of Nicaea reached its peak, Michael saw his opening. The Latin Empire was crumbling from within, bled dry by endless wars with the Bulgarians and the internal decay of its fractured feudal lords. The turning point came not through a massive, grand invasion, but through a stroke of tactical brilliance. While the Latin lords were distracted by their own squabbles, Michael's agents, led by the resourceful Alexios Strategopoulos, moved through the darkness. In a lightning strike that caught the city's exhausted defenders completely off guard, the Nicaean forces breached the outskirts and surged toward the walls. By the time the Latin Regency realized the gravity of the situation, the momentum of history had already shifted. The reconquest was not a slow siege, but a sudden, violent correction of the natural order. When Michael VIII finally entered the city, he did not enter merely as a conqueror but as a restorer. He stepped into the Hagia Sophia, not as a foreign king but as the legitimate Basilius, reclaiming the throne that had been stolen in the blood and fire of 1204. To the world, it was a miracle. To the Greeks, it was the resurrection of the Roman soul. But the restoration was a poisoned chalice. Michael VIII had inherited a city that was a ghost of its former self. The grand palaces were in ruins. The commerce had shifted to Italian maritime republics, and the empire's borders had shrunk to a mere fraction of their former glory. He was a man ruling a kingdom of ruins. To secure his position, Michael engaged in a dangerous game of high-stakes diplomacy. He sought to heal the great schism between the Orthodox East and the Catholic West, hoping to win the support of the papacy against the rising threat of the Turks. This move, while politically brilliant, was a spiritual catastrophe. It alienated his own people, the very citizens he had saved, who viewed any concession to Rome as a betrayal of their faith. Michael VIII had succeeded in bringing the empire back to its heart, but in doing so, he had ignited a new kind of internal struggle. He had restored the city, but he could not restore the empire's absolute power. The reconquest of 1261 was a magnificent triumph, a moment of unparalleled glory, but it was also the beginning of a long, agonizing twilight. The Roman eagle had returned to its nest, but the sky around it was growing increasingly dark. 1350, the walls of Constantinople. The euphoria of the Restoration had long since evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard reality of survival. The dream of a rejuvenated Roman Empire, a sprawling Mediterranean superpower, had proven to be a beautiful, fleeting mirage. As the mid-14th century dawned, the map of the Byzantine world no longer resembled the grand tapestry of the Macedonian era. Instead, it looked like a tattered shroud, clinging desperately to the shores of the Marmara. The empire was no longer a state in any traditional sense. It had become a city-state with a few scattered provinces, a collection of disconnected islands of Greek authority in a rising sea of foreign powers. The reconquest of 1261 had been a triumph of spirit, but it had failed to provide the economic or territorial foundation necessary to sustain a true empire. To the west, the old threats had evolved. The Latin powers, once the primary occupiers, had retreated, but they left behind a legacy of economic dominance that the Byzantines could never reclaim. The Italian maritime republics, Venice and Genoa, held the empire in an invisible stranglehold. They controlled the trade routes, they commanded the seas, and they bled the imperial treasury dry through predatory customs duties and lopsided treaties. Constantinople sat at the crossroads of the world, yet it grew increasingly impoverished, a landlord in its own house, watching as the wealth of the East flowed through its harbors into the coffers of Italy. But the true existential threat was not coming from the sea. It was rising from the soil of Anatolia. The once fertile heartland of the empire, the Anatolian plateau that had provided the backbone of Byzantine manpower and grain for centuries, was being devoured. The Seljuk Turks had long since faded, but in their wake, a new and far more disciplined predator had emerged, the Ottoman Beylik. Small at first, a mere nomadic principality on the Byzantine frontier, the Ottomans possessed a terrifying momentum. They were fueled by the ideology of Ghazi warfare and a military organization that was rapidly outstripping the aging, fractured Byzantine themes. By the mid-1300s, the Byzantine presence in Asia Minor was being systematically erased. One by one, the great fortress cities fell. Bursa, Nicaea, Nicomedia, the very cities that had served as the staging grounds for the empire's greatest recoveries, were falling to the Ottoman crescent. The frontier was not just moving, it was collapsing inward. As the Anatolian territories vanished, the empire's focus shifted toward the Balkans, where it found itself trapped in a chaotic web of shifting alliances, Bulgarian incursions, and Serbian expansion. The Byzantine emperor was no longer a sovereign of nations. He was a player in a desperate, localized game of survival, constantly forced to trade land for peace or gold for time. Constantinople, the queen of cities, remained unconquered, protected by its legendary Theodosian walls and its formidable position on the Bosphorus. But the walls had become a cage. The empire had been compressed into a singular urban nucleus. It was a magnificent, gilded shell, surrounded by enemies on all sides: the Venetians in the waves, the Bulgarians and Serbs in the mountains, and the Ottomans on the horizon. The Roman eagle was no longer soaring. It was huddled, waiting for the storm to break. 1354, the Gallipoli Peninsula. The storm that the Byzantines had long feared did not arrive as a single, sudden thunderclap, but as a slow, inexorable tide. For decades, the Ottoman Turks had been a frontier phenomenon, a collection of nomadic warriors and disciplined skirmishers chipping away at the edges of the Anatolian plateau. But in the mid-14th century, the nature of the threat changed fundamentally. The Ottomans were no longer merely raiding the borders, they were crossing them. Through a combination of opportunistic alliances and sheer military persistence, the Ottomans achieved what many thought impossible. They established a permanent foothold in Europe. By seizing the fortress of Gallipoli, they had bridged the gap between Asia and the Balkans. The Byzantine Empire was no longer just being squeezed from the east, it was being encircled. The Ottoman crescent now cast a shadow over both sides of the Dardanelles, turning the Marmara Sea into an Ottoman lake and leaving Constantinople isolated in a sea of hostile territory. Under the leadership of ambitious commanders like Orhan and later Murad I, the Ottoman state underwent a metamorphosis. It evolved from a loose confederation of tribal warriors into a highly centralized, professional war machine. They developed the Janissary Corps, an elite infantry of slave soldiers whose absolute loyalty was to the Sultan alone, not to a landed aristocracy or a distant emperor. This provided the Ottomans with a level of tactical discipline and political stability that the fractured, civil war-plagued Byzantine state could never hope to match. As the Ottomans expanded, they did so with a terrifying efficiency. They did not merely conquer, they integrated. They absorbed the local populations, utilized the administrative structures of the lands they took, and fueled their expansion through the concept of Gaza, holy warfare. To the Byzantine observer, it felt as though the very earth was shifting beneath their feet. Every time a Byzantine emperor looked to the east to rally his themes or secure his borders, he found only empty plains and the rising minarets of new Ottoman towns. The geopolitical reality for Constantinople had become claustrophobic. The empire was caught in a pincer movement. To the north and west, the Balkan kingdoms were in constant flux, but to the south and east, the Ottoman presence was monolithic and growing. The Byzantine emperors were forced into a humiliating dance of diplomacy, often paying tribute to the very sultans who were systematically dismantling their domains. They were essentially paying for the privilege of not being destroyed, buying mere months or years of existence with gold that the empire no longer possessed. By the time the late 14th century approached, the Ottoman Beylik had transformed into a true empire in its own right. They had captured Adrianople, turning it into a new capital in Europe, effectively cutting the lifeline between Constantinople and its remaining Balkan territories. The Queen of Cities was now an island in an Ottoman sea. The walls that had protected Rome and defended the East for a millennium were no longer the shield of a civilization. They were the final barricades of a dying era. The Roman eagle was not just huddled, it was trapped, watching as the new masters of the East prepared to claim the ultimate prize. 1439, the Council of Florence. As the Ottoman shadow deepened, stretching from the hills of Thrace to the very gates of the Golden Horn, the emperors of Byzantium realized a terrifying truth. The walls, once invincible, could not hold against the sheer weight of a rising superpower alone. The era of imperial self-sufficiency was over. To survive, Constantinople needed more than just stone and Greek fire. It needed the swords of the West. But there was a price for such salvation, and it was a price that struck at the very heart of the Byzantine identity. For centuries, the Great Schism of 1054 had carved a deep, bleeding wound between the Greek East and the Latin West. The Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church were not merely different in ritual, they were different in soul. To the Byzantines, the Latins were heretical interlopers who had once sacked their city in 1204. To the Pope in Rome, the Greeks were stubborn schismatics who refused to acknowledge the primacy of the Holy See. Yet, as the Ottoman drums grew louder, the emperors were forced into a desperate spiritual gambit. They began to offer the one thing they held most sacred, the union of the churches. They promised to submit to the Pope, to accept Latin dogma, and to fold the Orthodox Church into the Roman fold, all in exchange for a crusade of Western knights to break the Ottoman siege. The diplomacy was frantic and fueled by pure survival instinct. At the Council of Florence, amidst the marble halls of Italy, the Byzantine delegation, led by the Emperor John VII Palaeologus, signed the Decree of Union. On paper, the schism was healed. The cross was reunited. The emperor returned to Constantinople hoping to find the sails of a massive Western armada on the horizon. But instead of a crusade, he found a revolution of resentment. The people of Constantinople did not see the Union as a bridge to salvation. They saw it as a betrayal of God. In the streets, in the monasteries, and within the very pews of the Hagia Sophia, a fierce resistance took root. The sentiment was captured in a famous, haunting saying of the era, "Better the Sultan's turban than the Pope's mitre." To the common Byzantine, it was better to live under the rule of an infidel than to lose their soul to a Latin master. The union failed not because the diplomats were incompetent, but because the wound of the schism was too deep to be healed by political necessity. The Western powers, too, were fractured. The kings of France, England, and the various German princes were embroiled in their own wars, their interest in a Greek crusade waning even as the Ottoman threat peaked. The promised relief was a phantom, a collection of half-hearted expeditions and minor skirmishes that provided no real defense against the professional machine of the Sultan. By the mid-15th century, the failed union had left the empire in a state of paralysis. They had alienated their own people in a futile attempt to buy help from a West that was either unable or unwilling to provide it. The religious unity was a hollow shell, a legal document that meant nothing to the soldiers on the walls or the citizens in the markets. The Byzantine Empire was now truly alone, spiritually divided, politically isolated, and physically surrounded. The final act was being set, and the silence from the West was the most terrifying sound of all. 1449, Constantinople. Out of the wreckage of failed diplomacy and the hollow promises of the West, a man ascended the throne of a ghost empire. Constantine XI Palaeologus was not a conqueror, nor was he a man of vast wealth or sprawling territories. He was a prince of a city-state, a ruler of little more than the capital itself and a few scattered fragments of the Peloponnese. When he took the crown, he did not inherit a superpower. He inherited a funeral procession. Constantine was a man of profound gravity, a ruler who understood the impossible math of his situation. He knew that the Ottoman Sultan, named II, was not merely another warlord, but a visionary driven by a singular historical obsession: the conquest of the city. The Ottoman machine was growing, fueled by a centralized administration and a relentless military spirit, while the Byzantine state was a skeletal remains of its former glory, its coffers empty, its population dwindling, and its people deeply divided by the bitter memory of the failed union with Rome. As Constantine prepared for the inevitable, he did not retreat into the luxury of the palace. Instead, he became a man of the ramparts. He spent his short reign attempting to patch the cracks in a crumbling vessel. He sought aid from every corner of Christendom, but the response was a chorus of indifference. The West, once promised as a savior, offered only small, insufficient contingents of soldiers, men who were more interested in the spoils of war than the preservation of an ancient, dying faith. By the spring of 1453, the end was no longer a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. The Ottoman army, a tide of hundreds of thousands, gathered outside the Theodosian walls. They brought with them the terrifying new science of gunpowder, monstrous bronze cannons capable of shattering stone that had stood for a millennium. Inside the walls, Constantine stood with a ragtag assembly of Greeks, Italians, and Genoese volunteers. They were outnumbered perhaps 10-1. When the final assault began on the morning of May 29th, the world seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with the sulphurous stench of cannon fire and the screams of the dying. The walls, the very symbol of Byzantine resilience, were being systematically pulverized. As the Ottoman janissaries breached the gates, the imperial authority dissolved into the chaos of hand-to-hand combat. In those final, desperate hours, the legend of the last emperor was forged. History tells us that Constantine, seeing that all hope was lost and the city was falling, refused to flee. He did not seek the safety of a ship or the sanctuary of a foreign court. Instead, he cast aside his imperial regalia, the purple silks and the golden crown that marked him as the successor to Augustus and Constantine the Great. He became just another soldier in the breach. He disappeared into the smoke and the blood of the final struggle. No body was ever identified. No tomb was ever found. Whether he fell by a blade or was crushed under the weight of the collapsing empire, Constantine XI became something greater than a man. He became a myth. He became the marble emperor, the eternal guardian who would one day rise from the earth to reclaim the city. With his disappearance, the lineage of the Caesars, unbroken for 1,500 years, finally reached its end. The Middle Ages were over. The sun had set on Rome. May 29, 1453, Constantinople. The dawn did not break with the promise of a new day, but with the thunderous roar of a world being torn asunder. For 53 days, the city had endured the relentless pounding of Orban's monstrous cannons, the heavy iron projectiles battering the ancient stones of the Theodosian walls. But as the first light of May 29th touched the Golden Horn, the rhythm of the siege shifted from a bombardment into a final, catastrophic crescendo. The Ottoman Sultan, maimed II, sensing the exhaustion of the defenders, launched a multi-pronged assault. First came the irregular troops, the Azaps, sent to exhaust the Byzantine line. Then came the heavy cavalry. And finally the hammer of the Sultan, the Janissaries. These elite, disciplined shock troops moved through the smoke like shadows of death, their eyes fixed on the breach. In the chaos of the morning, the unthinkable happened. A small postern gate, the Kirkaporta, had been left unsecured, or perhaps breached by the sheer weight of the bombardment. Through this narrow opening, the Ottoman tide began to pour into the city. The cry went up through the streets of Constantinople, not of victory, but of terror. The city is taken. The defense collapsed into a desperate, primal struggle. In the shadow of the Hagia Sophia, the last remnants of the Byzantine military fought with the ferocity of men who knew they were fighting for the very soul of their civilization. There was no retreat left. There was only the blood-soaked cobblestone. As the Ottoman banners were raised atop the ramparts, the thousand-year-old continuity of the Roman East was severed. The light of the Greek East, which had preserved the wisdom of antiquity through the darkest centuries of the West, was being extinguished by the rising crescent. As the smoke cleared, the city, once the queen of cities, the jewel of the Mediterranean and the bastion of Christendom, lay in ruins. The streets, once filled with the processions of emperors and the chants of monks, were filled with the spoils of war. The great church, the Hagia Sophia, which had stood as the spiritual heart of the Orthodox world for a millennium, was transformed. The icons were covered, the bells fell silent, and the echoes of the liturgy were replaced by the call to prayer. But the fall of Constantinople was more than the death of a city. It was the closing of a door. With the breach of the walls, the medieval world died. The geopolitical center of gravity shifted. The Silk Road, once anchored by the Byzantine presence, was now controlled by the Ottomans, forcing European explorers to look westward across the Atlantic in search of new routes to the Indies. This search would inadvertently spark the age of discovery, leading to the encounter with the Americas and the birth of the modern era. Furthermore, as Byzantine scholars fled the falling city, they carried with them the precious Greek manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, and Homer. They brought the embers of classical knowledge to the Italian peninsula, acting as the primary catalyst for the Renaissance. The Roman Empire had not simply vanished, it had transformed. Its legal structures, its faith, and its lost knowledge would go on to shape the foundations of the modern West. But as the sun set over the ruins of the Theodosian walls, the era of knights, emperors, and walled citadels was gone. The Middle Ages had ended, and the world was irrevocably changed.